Welcome everybody! This is the 2023 edition of my convention history panel called Cons Before and After Furries. I'm Transformative with the Convention History Project. So I've been presenting my research on the topic of fan conventions for the last 10 years now, and at the 2022 Midwest Furfest, I created a new edition of my panel specifically for furry cons called Cons Before and After Furries. However, it's a panel that basically encompasses the entire 80-year of the convention scene, from the early science fiction cons all the way to the virtual events during the pandemic lockdown period. So it's a panel that everyone can enjoy, not just furries. So this panel was presented at Further Confusion, Anthro New England, furthermore Furnal Equinox, Las Vegas Furcon, Furry Weekend Atlanta, Furlandia, AnthroCon, Denfur, Megaplex, and BLFC. As well, I also presented panels at KawaiiKon, BABSCon, Whinny City, PonyCon, and Everfree Northwest this year. After a year of doing this panel, I decided to retire this version of it, as I'm planning a brand new panel for 2024. For preservation's sake, I decided to upload the final version of this panel I presented at BLFC this last October. So, this version I've presented at FurryCons basically follow the same structure. However, because my panels are unscripted and ad-lib, sometimes I go on long tangents on specific topics, sometimes I skip over some topics due to time constraints. To make a more complete version of this panel, I also included audio from my Furnal Equinox version of the panel, as well as the AnthroCon version I did at KawaiiKon and the PonyCon version I did at BABSCon this year. As well, I also included audio from Mark Molino's surprise appearance at Las Vegas Furcon to fill out the furry section of this panel. Next year will be the 85th year since the first Worldcon, and if there was one message I want to get out doing these convention history panels for the last 10 years, basically it's this: all of us, furries, bronies, trekkies, otaku, comic fans, science fiction fans, fantasy fans, we're all part of one giant fandom family. We all help influence each other, we all help each other grow, whether we realize it or not. This is my love letter to the world of volunteer fan conventions. And with that, please enjoy.
And no matter how much time goes by, the party will still be here with some fun new games to try. Big adventures waiting, obviously. Long as we're still here together, we'll be flying happily. 1, 2, 1, 2. This is where the magic happens. This is where the magic lives. Friendships weave together stronger. The bonds grow deeper, lasting longer. This is where the magic happens. This is where the magic lives. And the greatest spell you'll know is how the magic of friendship grows. Let's go!
So this panel is something I've been doing for the last few years. A little bit about me. I've been working on the convention history project for at least a decade now. I realized that there's never really been a complete history on conventions in general. Most fandoms only really focus on their own specific histories. And I want to show that all these different fandoms, the convention scene, they're all interconnected. So I've been doing a version of this panel at anime cons, furry cons, science fiction cons for the last few years. This version I made at the beginning of last year, so this is the version I presented at MFF last year. And I think this is going to be the last time I'm doing this version. I'm going to retire this version before I work on a new version of the panel. But this panel is called Cons Before and After Furries. So I do want to talk about where furries come from, but I don't want to isolate furries from the over 80-year history of the convention scene that eventually would give way to the furries. So the panel kind of runs about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how much I have to talk about. I end it with a little montage, and at that point, that's when you could, I would probably take questions and answers, but to kind of keep the pace going, I do have everything, I don't have a script, everything's just all ad-libbed in my head. So that's how we're gonna get started. So you might saw the infographic that I posted earlier. I've been working on my own version of the convention history timeline. Like, I really want to show that this is one giant family tree, that furries, bronies, trekkies, otaku, all the different facets of pop culture fandoms all really come from a similar original source. I studied genetic biology at Johns Hopkins University, so as you kind of see, I kind of apply that same evolutionary diagram to a family tree such as this, and it kind of works the same way. You kind of see how each con kind of evolved and influenced something beforehand. So this is kind of a more simplified version where I show all the different branching points, specifically coming off of the original science fiction convention scene, how we see how the comic cons, the anime cons, the furry cons all kind of branched off and eventually created our own little family tree as well. And here's kind of a more, I guess, organic version of that, kind of showing the attendance growth represented by the the thickening of each of the different branches and timelines. And this also is going to show why, what the change is from what the general convention scene. So if you look at the original timeline, the science fiction cons are going to be the major branch of this tree. This is because for the first 40 years of conventions, the term science fiction was kind of the catch-all term for all pop culture. Now, retroactively, we call science fiction, space opera, all that stuff. But in reality, science fiction during this period also includes fantasy, horror, comic books, cartoons. So anything you could think of that was considered pop culture that wasn't literary was under the umbrella of science fiction. And eventually, as science fiction became more and more specialized, so going more harder into the space operas, fantasy going to more sort of sorcery, you start seeing the idea of a general convention branch off and eventually form its own separate branch as well. But the biggest branch is always going to be what is the default multimedia con of that period as well. So right here we have the furry cons, and we're going to get to the point, but I want to at least go over the first few decades of convention history before we finally get to the furries. And since Bronies are kind of the sibling to the furry side as well, we're going to touch a little bit about the Bronies cons as well. So we're going to start at the golden age of science fiction. So most people mark the golden age of science fiction as being in 1938, and that's also the golden age of comics. So it's interesting that both science fiction and comics have their golden age start the same year. What's interesting though is while during the golden age of science fiction fans are going to create the first science fiction cons, it won't be until comics end their golden age when they actually start making their own comic cons. But we'll get to that later. So let's talk about the early science fiction cons. So like I said, this was the catch-all term for all pop culture during this period. Now, you also have to remember how a lot of these fandoms started. Fandoms have, of course, been a thing since as long as there is some written word, someone has always been a fan of something. You had the literary saloons of Victorian England. You had fanzines that were popular during this time period, even before the science fiction golden age. But a lot of fans, specifically in the science fiction golden age, were a little bit upset that their favorite science fiction authors were not getting recognized by the wider media literary landscape. And to honor their favorite writers and artists who were not seen as literary by other literary magazines and reviewers, they would make their own little fanzines and communicate with each other, and eventually thought, hey, why don't we just form our own little get-together to kind of honor a lot of these science fiction authors. Now, if you ask any old school science fiction fan what the first science fiction convention is, they're going to come up with two answers. That's going to be Furcon, and that's going to be Leeds. So let's go look at some of these early science fiction events. So these are the earliest ones I could kind of track, and it's kind of wishy-washy because a lot of them, some people have different definitions of what they consider the first convention, and we're going to break it down. So you ask any old school science fiction fan, these are going to be the first two conventions they consider. The first Eastern Conference, also known as Furcon, Furcon, if you know the history of AnthroCon, also had a hand in the creation of AnthroCon. And the first British conference, which is also known as the convention in Leeds. Now, when I asked them, okay, well, there's actually another event that happened the year before called the first Science Fiction League meeting. So that was a 2-day event. It had roughly the same amount of attendees. So why don't science fiction fans consider this the first con? And they were like, well, because it doesn't have the word conference or convention in its name. So at that point, it's all semantics. So if we brush aside semantics, I want to use my definition of what I consider the first convention. And this is one that a lot of people also consider the first WorldCon that was held in 1939. Now, why do I consider WorldCon the first convention by my standard? Because WorldCon will kind of lay the template and foundation for every single con afterwards. So if you go to any modern anime con, Star Trek con, Brony con, Furry con, you can see the DNA in each of these very, very different type of cons have their roots in WorldCon. So WorldCon uniquely is the first to have over 100 confirmed attendees, and it's also the first to be held over the course of 3 days. Now, if you look at all these previous ones, they were only 1-day events. These were essentially like fan club meetings where they would meet up with other fans. WorldCon was the first to introduce what we call the hotel model. So basically, you rent out a hotel venue and hold your programming and events within the hotel over the course of 3 days. And by that standard, I think WorldCon basically could lay the foundation for all these conventions. So when I say the first convention, I specifically mean, by my definition, the WorldCon model. So a little bit about WorldCon. WorldCon was essentially trying to make use of the popularity of the World's Fair that was happening in New York that year. So that's actually where they got their name from. It was from the World's Fair. And since a lot of people were already in town for the World's Fair, why not just have a science fiction event during that same period? So they basically rented out a hotel over July 4th weekend and decided to have their own little mini event. So this is where we have the first hotel-specific convention, the first programming, and this is also where we get the first early cosplay. So Forrest Ackerman, one of the editors of the science fiction magazines during this period, and his girlfriend at that time dressed up in science fiction outfits. So most people consider this the first cosplay, and this would be years before the term cosplay was finally coined, but most people will say this was considered the first cosplay. You start seeing a lot of elements that started at WorldCon that we could trace to almost every single con now. So the idea of having badges and badge ribbons and lanyards, all this stuff you could trace all the way to WorldCon. In fact, if you go to a lot of science fiction cons today, these old school science fiction cons, you see a lot of attendees wear badges that have ribbons upon ribbons and ribbons and ribbons, because that's something they really like doing. And what's interesting is someone asked me later, well, business cons also have like the badges and ribbons and lanyards. Like, where did that come from? And I thought, you know what? My theory is because a lot of people who are attending all these business cons are probably grew up as kids attending these old science fiction cons, and just is a natural continuation of doing that. So if my theory is true, then you can also trace all these business events to this early science fiction con. Now, some of the other stuff that we will start seeing, we would have a proto dealer's den, we would have an art show. An art show would be a very, very big thing in science fiction cons. Some old school furry cons still have an art show. But one of the early things we could also trace is the first dead dog party. So a dead dog at a lot of cons refer to the last event of the con. So sometimes you have a dead dog dance, sometimes you have a dead dog panel, but most oftentimes you have a dead dog party, which is where the volunteers, the staffers, kind of, at the end of closing up the con, just finish up all the alcohol and celebrate holding a successful con. And we can actually trace the first dead dog party by that name to Mark Weitzinger's house 4 days after the last WorldCon. So WorldCon basically was not just the first for all this stuff. You could see WorldCon was the first for a lot of traditions. Like, a lot of people think dead dogs are a modern thing, but no. Dead dogs also started with the very first WorldCon. And so, like I said, WorldCon also had the first official programming. So this is actually where we had the idea of having panel rooms. And what's interesting about these early science fiction cons are you only have like one panel room and one panel happening at the same time. So we don't have it where we have multi-programming rooms where there's different panels. it was assumed because these cons are small enough, there's only a few hundred attendees at most at these conventions, it was assumed the entire con will sit into one panel, leave, take a break, come back and watch all the different panels. So there was only one paneling happening at the same time during these events. So after the first Worldcon, one attendee in one of the fanzines decided to draw his experience at the Worldcon, and you can see there's a long line for a badge pickup, and you know, over 80 years later, BLFC, there's also a long line for badge pickup. So that's one thing Worldcon started that has not changed, is the long badge pickup line. That's something that's always going to be around. All right, so the first Worldcon was in New York, but the second Worldcon was in Chicago. And that's interesting because we kind of associate most modern cons with sticking specifically to one city. You have Comic-Con in San Diego, you have AnthroCon in Pittsburgh, but Worldcon was kind of seen, like I said, it was modeled off the World's Fair during this period, and it's kind of like the Olympics, where each city, a science fiction club representing a different city, will try and pitch a bid to host the Worldcon. So what's interesting is Worldcon isn't really owned by one specific entity. There is a board, and they protected the trademark, but each year the staff completely change over from Worldcon to Worldcon. It's handed on from one to another. In fact, this tradition still continues. The last Worldcon was held in Chicago last year, so the 8th time it was back in Chicago. Worldcon this year was held in China for its first time, and the next year Worldcon's going to be held in Glasgow. And then it looks like Seattle is the only series bid for the following year. So how do people kind of vote on who's going to host the next Worldcon? Well, this is where party floors come into play. The party floor is going to be very, very important. So before we get more onto the party floor, let's talk about KawaiiKon, which is the second Worldcon and the first held in Chicago. KawaiiKon introduced a lot of new events that will kind of become staples. First, it was the first con to have a con suite. So Con Suite was kind of like the hospitality suite of that time period. It eventually evolved into the hospitality suite that you would see with a lot of old school conventions. But most importantly, it was the first costume masquerade. So the masquerade was basically where people dress up as your own favorite fictional characters, early proto cosplay, and you would have a big show Saturday evening. This was the highlight of the convention. Saturday evening, you have a giant show where each person goes on stage in their costumes, performs the skits, and move on. And this is important because this is eventually, I'm going to connect it to how the fursuit parade eventually evolved, but we'll get to there at that point. The next important thing is this is where we have the first organized filking, or fan music. Now, fan music is very, very important with these conventions. So a little bit about folk music. So folk actually came from a misspelling of the word folk. And basically, during this period, you would have a lot of attendees, specifically during the first Worldcon. They were part of a group called the Futurians. The Futurians were kind of a more socialist-leaning labor union protest group. And they were they would be big in the science fiction community during this period. So during the first Worldcon in New York, they would come and sing, the protest songs. The following year at KawaiiKon, they decided to print out the sheet music and sing some of these protest songs, but sometimes replace the word with their science fiction characters. So over the years, you would see people randomly go into sporadic singing. So these cons, like I said, were held in hotels. What do hotels have? Almost every single hotel has a lobby with a piano there. So someone might just come up to the piano, play some music, everyone gathers up in a circle and start, singing along. These hotels will also have empty panel rooms like this. So most of the time, someone will just sit in an empty panel room, gather the chairs in a circle, start playing on the guitar, and other people will just come in, see the music, and join in and start singing. Over the years, the words to these protest songs were lost, and they decided to replace them with, songs about their favorite fictional characters during this period. So you'll have like Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers, eventually Star Trek and Doctor Who characters. So filk was officially coined in 1955, but it's been a part of the convention scene since its very first convention. So a lot of these cons, Worldcon would then move around. So it was held in Denfur, then it was held in Los Angeles. It was kind of paused during World War II. But aside from WorldCon, since WorldCon could be held in any location, WesternCon was kind of created as a con that would be specifically held in North America. So if WorldCon was held outside the United States, there would still at least be a science fiction con in the country you could attend. And then the next major type of con that came out during this period was Midwest Con. Midwest Con basically started the concept of a relaxing con. So basically the entire definition I gave for what I say WorldCon is kind of the foundation for what I use for what a con is. Throw that all out the window because Midwest Con is basically, we're just going to gather in a hotel, no dealers hall, no panels, nothing. We're just going to take over the hotel and just kind of have fun. So just hang out. So this creates the concept of what we call a relaxing con. So a good equivalent in the furry community is we have Furry Fiesta, and Furry Fiesta has a sister con called Furry Siesta. Furry Siesta is a much more laid-back, relaxed convention. For the early Furry Siestas, there was no musical events, no panel, there's still no panels, and there's no dealer's den. So you can kind of see Furry Siesta as kind of the furry version of a relaxing con. The next major thing to happen is the Hugo Awards were formed. The Hugo Awards are considered the highest literary awards in the genre of fiction. So the highest award you could win in science fiction and the fantasy genre. One of the top awards, and what's unique about the Hugo Awards is it's not voted on by a committee of professionals. It's voted on by the attendees of that year's con. So that gives the power to the attendees. And you also have to remember, con goers during this time, they were not technically just attendees, they were members. You weren't buying a badge to enter an event, you were buying a membership into a club, and that membership allowed you to go to the board meetings, and if you go to old school world cons and science fiction cons, they still have board meetings, and it allows you to vote for the Hugo Awards. So the attendees had a say in what they could vote on, which is interesting because of conventions held in different parts. Like this year it's held in China, so you might see a lot more science fiction writers in China win the award. So that's how important the World Cons are. So let's go to the party floor. So like I said, WorldCon and the science fiction cons during this period, science fiction again was a catch-all term for all pop culture. So this would include comics, animation, fantasy, horror. So if you wanted to meet up with your like-minded fans, how would you do it? So most of these old school science fiction cons will have a giant bulletin board, a giant community board in the lobby of the hotel where you can put post-it notes or you can write something on there. So for example, you might write, Doctor Who fans come to Hyatt 305 at 8 p.m. and we'll watch some John Pertwee episodes, for example. And this is how you would meet up with your like-minded fans. And this is where smaller fandoms would get to meet up at this larger event. So nowadays, you would have specific meetups at anime or comic or furry cons. But back then, this is how they would meet up, by having a giant community board and a party floor where you could do it. That's why if you go to a lot of old school science fiction cons, the party floor still plays a very, very big role in the event. And a lot of furry cons that kind of came from this tradition will still have the party floor. So Furry Confusion, for example, still has a party floor because it's very much a part of that tradition. And what's also interesting about that as well is when we later look at the Brony fandom, most Brony cons were formed separately outside the science fiction con sphere. There's only one PonyCon that had a direct influence from the science fiction community, and that's BABSCon through BABSCon. And because BABSCon was the only convention that was originally started with influence from the science fiction con scene, it's also for the longest time was the only PonyCon that had that community bulletin board as well and the room party floor. So interesting if you actually break down the DNA of all these different events. Now, how would you also communicate with your different with the attendees? So before we have apps that would update attendees and correct the schedule, before we had Twitter, the con staffers would have to update fans through mimeograph newsletters. So if a panel room changed, if a panelist dropped out of an author book signing was moved to a different booth, this is how they would update them. And normally you would have like 3 to 5 newsletters printed each day that would be handed out. And this is how people would communicate with updates during their cons. And nowadays, a lot of old school science fiction cons still continue to do this tradition. Even though we have apps and stuff now, they still will do photocopies of newsletters because it's just part of that tradition right now. All right, So for the first period, we had the golden age of comics and the golden age of science fiction. Both of them kind of end their golden age around the same period. Science fiction specifically ends their golden age with a shift to what we call new wave science fiction. New wave science fiction saw a split between fantasy and science fiction, where science fiction started to go more towards hard space opera, hard science, and sometimes more grim dystopian settings, while fantasy kind of took the sword and sorcery route, heavily influenced by J.R.R. Tolkien, and went what we call escapist high fantasy route. On the other hand, the Silver Age of comics started to see a resurgence in superheroes as a genre. So for the longest time, comics, yes, they were started and dominated by superheroes, but after the World War, a lot of GIs coming back home didn't want to see, Superman instantly just punch out Hitler and instantly the war is over. So a lot of comics during this period shifted away from superheroes and started focusing on romance, horror, kaiju stories as well, which is kind of interesting. That's actually where Marvel got its name, was because it was doing basically their own knockoffs of Godzilla during its period. But then we have the comics called Authority, and that kind of changed things. So a lot of the grim horror stories that were being printed in comics were a no-go, so it shifted back to superheroes kind of taking the reins. Most importantly, we had two movements within DC Comics where you had the Flash of Two Worlds, which had the Silver Age Flash interact with the Golden Age Flash, and then you had the Fantastic Four and the Avengers coming out of Marvel Comics, and this basically lit a new wave of comic fans. And these comic fans, again, they were also science fiction fans, and they would communicate in these zines. So these comic fans decided to also make their own zine and would communicate with each other during these periods. And again, science fiction was a catch-all term, so comic book fans would have to meet up at science fiction cons and go to these room parties. But eventually it got to the point where they were even saying that we could pull one zine here in 1962, which says the comic fandom will not be a fandom in its own right until it hosts its own convention. So it's inevitable. Comic fans are going to eventually host their own convention. And what's widely regarded as the first comic book convention by most comic historians is New York Comic Con, also known as Tri-State Comic Con. The very first Comic Con. Now, WorldCon was the first con that I used by my definition because it was held over the course of 3 days. But you'll start seeing a lot of these cons start as one-day cons, the Comic Cons and the Anime Cons. So they don't fall neatly into my definition of what I laid out with WorldCon, but they would have a lot of elements and pick up things that WorldCon eventually would develop. So New York Comic Con was held one day. A group of high school students basically pitched around this idea, even saying, hey, we can hold it in our own house if we need to. And basically had rented out a small little room in a community center and had the first convention. You could kind of see a map of the convention in the bottom. It was essentially just one giant dealer's room with 6 dealers at this time, and that was it. And you'll notice the difference between the science fiction cons and the comic cons. The science fiction cons were more about programming, while the comic cons are more about the dealers. And I think this is interesting. Before I actually was looking at some of the early science comic cons, I kind of did notice the trend. And you could kind of see the distinction because science fiction cons were basically fan-run volunteer cons, basically made by fans to kind of help support and promote the industry. On the other hand, you start seeing comic cons basically are industry-run events, normally for-profit, who are basically trying to attract fans to, give them money. So it's a complete opposite subversion. Now, some of the interesting things that these early comic cons would start developing is what will eventually evolve into the exhibitor hall at a lot of these conventions. So most dealer halls at cons up to this point were kind of like early swap meets. People would just have tables of props, old books, old comics, and that was it. Now, to have a place to kind of sell more and more comics, this is where they would try to attract more guests. So unlike the science fiction cons that basically would have one guest of honor and maybe one fan guest of honor, the Comic Con started the trend of let's fill our con book up with tons and tons and tons of guests of honor. Now, this was a way to get a lot of people to come to the con without having to pay them as guests of honor. This is where they created the concept of the Artist Alley. And it's interesting because the Artist Alley developed twice independently, once in America with the Comic Cons and once in Japan with Comic-Con. But the American Artist Alley was essentially a professional artist alley. So these are people who professionally work in the comic book industry. They worked on Batman, they worked on Superman, and this was a way to get a lot of big name artists to come to your convention for free without having to pay them as a guest, to sign books, do commissions, sell original artwork, and this is where we get the start of the professional artist alley. So a lot of these early Comic Cons were heavily inspired or run by kids who grew up with these early science fiction cons. So two individuals I want to point out. One, Sheldorf, basically took over a small fair in Detroit called Chicago Triple Fan Fair, which kind of focused on comics, but it wasn't a comic-specific con. It was just one subsection. He later moved to San Diego in 1970. Then you had Ken Kruger, who attended the first World Con, then later founded the Buffalo Science Fantasy League, and later made his own Buffalo Con in his mom's house. He also moved to San Diego. And it's interesting, these two individuals who were running these small science fiction cons eventually moved to San Diego in 1970, and by coincidence, they met up, they interacted with some other fans, and they decided to start what we now know as San Diego Comic-Con, which started as Golden State Comic Book Convention. So this is where we get the birth of San Diego Comic-Con. You can see San Diego Comic-Con, largest Comic-Con in the United States for the longest time until it was replaced by New York Comic-Con, which overtook it, had its roots directly within the science fiction con scene. Some other cons that also had their roots were Chicago Comic-Con, which started as Nostalgia 72. And like I was saying, this is where the Artist Alley started, but this is also where we get a lot of zine culture and underground comics getting started, specifically in Austin, Texas, and San Francisco, California. These were kind of the tube centers for the underground comics movement. This is where you get individuals like Robert Crumb, who made Fritz the Cat. And these were supposed to be comics that were kind of separated from the DC Marvel comics, superhero comics around this time. So you had this entire zine culture kind of develop, and you also had a lot of furry zines kind of pop up. Now, again, the term furry wasn't coined around this time, so these were anthropomorphic animal zines, or what we called funny animal comics during this time period. But you start seeing this vast underground evolution. Some of the major groups would be the Air Pirates in San Francisco, and they were the ones who did the parody of Mickey Mouse in their comics that essentially would lead to Disney taking them to court and doing the Mickey Mouse Copyright Protection Act, which extended the copyright laws. But in Japan, you had something similar happening. So in Japan as well, you also had a science fiction convention in Japan that was inspired by Worldcon that would have a little area of their convention for the underground comic fans to kind of draw their own comics and sell them. This area was called the Comic Market. And very similar to the fan comics, these specifically were fanzines that were very, very similar to what we were seeing in America. There were 8 to 10 page little short comics that took a lot of popular manga or anime characters, and just like a lot of the American comics, like the Tijuana Bibles, a lot of it, 90% of it, was adult sexual comics. So people think, okay, mature artwork and mature comics and fan art is a modern thing. No, it's been around since the beginning. In Japan, these fan-made comics are called dondinshi, and this is where you had a dondinshi or the doujin artists who formed these circles. Essentially, these groups would become so big they would overexpand the original science fiction cons they were hosting, and eventually Comic Market, what we now shorten as Comic-Con, was formed from these groups of people. They started to hold their own con called Comic Market, and Comic-Con developed a new type of artist alley. So as opposed to the artist alley that was developing in America, which were basically filled with people from the profession and industry, the artist alleys in Japan were filled with fan-made artists basically selling fan art and fan comics of characters they don't own the copyright to. Now, the laws in Japan are a little bit more lax And for the most part, these two different artist alleys will develop across the sea independently of each other. It's only in the 90s when the anime cons really have their foot in America that this will start causing trouble. But at the meantime, you have these two different artist alleys developing from very, very similar situations in the underground comics movement. Now, this is also where we get the rise of the funny animal comics. Now, this is where, if you look at the history of furries, you can kind of trace it to this period in the 70s with the funny animal comics. Now, it isn't that these animals are funny, it was just that comics were also called the funnies during this period. So you just had animals in the funnies. And one of the big ones was an Anthro character made by Steve Gillespie in his comic anthology Albedo. You can see the first issue here, which was basically just a space opera story. Again, still heavily influenced by science fiction during this period, but just had anthropomorphic characters. So this is one of the early points where we start seeing the early formations of where furries come from. They dominated specifically during the 70s and 80s, and we'll start seeing the formation of a lot of gatherings for people who like this. We won't really see room parties yet, but we'll start seeing people who kind of like this stuff and will try to get it displayed in art shows in these early dealer dens. Now, this is where we're going to start looking at the next really big jumping point in the convention evolution scene. So we have this giant light blue blur that I kind of put in the middle of the science fiction con. So you see the red coming off is the comic cons, and the yellow is the indie comics like Comic Cat and the zine comics. Now we're going to focus on this giant group, which is going to introduce a new type of fandom, and this is where the Trekkies come into play. So like I said, Trekkies and the Bronies are the two fandom-specific groups that really had a big impact on the scene, and I'm going to kind of explain why. So Gene Roddenberry at Worldcon 1966 basically announced, I'm working on a new show called Star Trek. So basically he was doing what Warner Brothers and Disney's doing now, going to San Diego Comic-Con announcing, hey, we have a new superhero movie coming out. He was basically doing this decades before all these industries started to do it, and I think he hit the right audience because he was promoting to Worldcon. It was Worldcon and these science fiction cons that were also heavily helping promote his new show, Star Trek, which became really, really popular. And there were some issues of it. Was it going to be renewed? Was it going to be canceled? So you started to see a lot of new science fiction fans entering the science fiction con scene. Now, this causes some problems because the science fiction cons, like I said, were created by now the old guard who started these cons in the 1930s, now seeing this new wave of young, hip fans talking about this new TV show that none of them care about or heard about. And there is a problem because programming for conventions since the 1930s all the way to the 70s for 40 years only had one program room and one programming track. So basically, how you were supposed to do these programs is everyone in the small convention will come into the programming room, they'll see the program, they'll see the panel, they'll leave, take a break, and come back. Essentially, you had one panel room with a set list of programming. And when you have a bunch of Star Trek fans now pitching Star Trek panels, you're going to start seeing a lot of Star Trek panels on the list, and a lot of the old science fiction fans are like, we don't care about this show. Why would we even bother going to the panels? So it took them 40 years to figure it out, but the cons are finally like, hey, we could hold more than one panel at the same time. And boom, you got the birth of what we call multi-track programming, or the programming track. So now, thanks to the influx of Star Trek fans filling these cons, they decided to split up the programs to different programming rooms. And a lot of cons still kind of continue this tradition. So you might have a programming room that's just fantasy, a programming room that's just furry, a programming room that's just alternate history, for example. And a lot of programming still do that. So a lot of cons still have a writing track specific programming room. And so after the Trekkies kind of filled out the science fiction cons, they were like, hey, we could actually start our own Star Trek specific conventions, and that's what they started to do. So the very first Star Trek con is Star Trek Lives, which was in New York City, and it's actually going to be interesting, but we're going to notice the first con of every genre is going to be kind of started in New York. But Star Trek Lives started in New York. It had 3,000 attendees, which is impressive because I don't even think this con has 3,000 attendees. So imagine a brand new convention right out the door, 3,000 attendees. Very impressive. This next year they had 6,000 attendees. The third year, Ticketmaster, which was around back then and also messes up back then, sold 15,000 tickets and they had to turn away at least another 6,000 attendees. So imagine, this is like really the first con to hit the 5-digit mark, and it was all around this small show called Star Trek back then. This is also why Star Trek's the Trekkies kind of become the model for, like I was showing at the beginning of the panel, whenever they wanted to mock cons or show a parody of what a con was, they normally always show Trekkies at a convention. And this is why, because the Trekkies really dominated the con scene during this period. And while the Trekkies then started, they popularized a lot of concepts that kind of be integrated into the mainstream culture. So the idea of slash fiction, shipping. In this specific period, it's also where we see two canonically straight male characters put into homosexual relationships during this period. This was very, very popular in the Star Trek fandom. Specifically, Kirk and Spock was the common ship during this period. Even though you could go all the way back to the Sherlock fandom doing this, it was really when it was popularized across all these different fandoms around this period. Fan fiction, self-insert fan fictions became very, very popular. This is where we get the term Mary Sue coin as well. This is where Trekkies really kind of held their own, and kind of I made these graphs to kind of show you. So Worldcon, like I said, was the first con by my definition, and the largest for the period, and also we could also see San Diego Comic-Con. So Worldcon's in blue, San Diego Comic-Con's in red, and boom, you see the Trekkies with their Star Trek cons just instantly dwarfing them right out the door. But then you also see it was a big influx and then started to trickle down. And that trickle down was because the show ended, the original series ended. It would be a while before Next Generation came about. So the Trekkies kind of had their big conventions, the cons dwindled, and the Trekkies kind of went integrated back into the science fiction convention scene. And we'll see a very similar thing with Bronies a few decades later. But some of the things the Trekkies did, like I said, they were the ones who introduced us to the idea of having more than one panel at the same time. They also introduced show-specific canon cosplay, because up to this point, most cosplay done at cons were based on someone's imagination, because most of the fiction during this period were short stories and anthologies or science fiction novels where there was really no specific outfit for these characters. So a lot of people created these outfits from imagination. So Star Trek and Doctor Who as well were really the first where you could get show-accurate cosplays done, and this is where cosplays really came about. You had charity auctions, you had basically dealer rooms explode, so this is where we get people who would sell props from the show, scripts, all this stuff happening. And then people thought, hey, we can make money out of cons, because again, for the longest time, cons were volunteer non-profit events, and all of a sudden you have KawaiiKon emerge that started to say, okay, well, we could kind of make our own for-profit Star Trek cons. And before the era of ReedPop or Wizard World, you had KawaiiKon basically now strategically making their own professional run con around the country. This is the period where also the term gopher was coined. And this was also the period where the word cosplay was coined during the 80s. Now, this is also where we get the group of a lot of con volunteer security forces. In fact, this is where we get the formation of Flair, which runs the security for this con, and the Dorsia Regulars, which will run the security for AnthroCon for a while. This is also where we get the next evolution in the dealer's hall, where you have a lot of people selling, props from the shows there as well. So a lot of the modern ideas of how we see conventions came about with the start of the Star Trek conventions. And in fact, if you look at most pop culture depictions of the generic nerdy convention, they would normally always represent it with Star Trek fans. But we'll see this again with the furries and bronies later on. As the Star Trek cons are dwindling, they were still well run with a lot of staffers who were really eager. So a lot of these Star Trek cons would start rebranding themselves as multimedia or multi-genre conventions. So now this is where we start seeing the shift where science fiction cons for the first 40 years were seen as the generic default pop culture conventions. Science fiction cons will now start moving towards the hard science fiction model. So the Star Trek cons will kind of shed the Star Trek layer and focus on generic generalized fandoms. So this is where the Star Trek cons kind of take the reins of becoming the general pop culture conventions during this period. So we see that here with the Star Trek cons eventually giving way to the multimedia conventions. But we're going to need to get here with the furries. So let's talk about the next important movement in the convention scene, and this is where we get the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. The Cartoon Fantasy Organization was founded by these two individuals, Fred Patton and Mark Morellino. In fact, it's funny, when I did this panel at Las Vegas Furcon, the moment I got to this slide, Mark just happened to walk through the door just by chance. At that point, I was like, I have to stop my panel and have him come on stage to tell his story because no one can tell the story better than he can. But these two individuals, important because they founded the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. So what's the Cartoon Fantasy Organization? So during this time, anime was not really a thing in the United States. In fact, the term anime wasn't even used. It was called Japanimation. And sometimes there would be some Japanimation being tested in specific markets on the West Coast in Hawaii. But most Americans will never have a chance to see anime. This is even before dubbing. So what would happen is people, when they would in the West Coast and Hawaii, would sometimes record bootleg versions of these test anime showings and would distribute them to different science fiction cons and let people see it. They will also distribute it to a lot of university clubs. So to kind of organize and coordinate the distributions of these bootleg anime recordings, you have groups like the Cartoon Fantasy Organization that would help, coordinate all this. And the Cartoon Fantasy Organization was based out of Los Angeles, but they would have a bunch of sister groups across the country. In San Antonio, in New York, and a lot of different places around the United States, but it was more of a loose organization. It wasn't a national network. It was more of a loose group with each of these different groups having their own independent reign over them. So Judy Nibbler was the one who coined the term, but one of the main groups outside of Los Angeles was the New York chapter of the Cartoon Fantasy Organization. Patricia Malone was the president of this specific group. And what they would do is they would coordinate with their own fanzines, specifically with these bootleg copies. And nowadays, piracy is looked down upon. But if it wasn't for these original groups distributing these bootleg anime wouldn't really be a thing in America as we know it. It was these fans who were distributing these tapes that kind of got that ball rolling. And this is also the period where we got the birth of college and university conventions. So for example, at Johns Hopkins University where I went, we have a group called JohnCon, which is our small college's convention, which we hold in our rec center. And if you look around the United States, you can find major universities with their own small 2 or 3 day fan convention. Sometimes these conventions will go on to evolve into larger conventions, as we'll see later on. But this is kind of the roots of where we kind of get them started. Now, this was before things were dubbed. So you had these bootleg VHS recordings of anime shows, and when you would walk into these small club meetings, they basically would just give you like a catalog that has a brief summary of what the anime is about, kind of flip notes of everything, just so you can understand. And you'll often have an interpreter kind of stand by the TV and explain, okay, so this happens, this is what's happening, this is what's happening. So you have kind of like this early proto, fandoming as the anime is going on. And to kind of represent some of the experiences people saw within the anime, some people will start pairing anime clips of animated shows with music. And basically, this is where we get the birth of the anime music video, or the AMV, which kind of becomes a very, very big staple of anime cons here in America. And in fact, the earliest one we could kind of see is Space Battleship Remoto paired with the Beatles' All You Need Is Love, and that's considered the first AMV. In fact, I think there's some old I don't think the original exists, but the original creator, he was only 21 years old when he created this in the 80s. He has since passed away, but he basically pieced together what he made back in the 80s, and you can still see it on his old YouTube channel as well.
I found a room with a TV in it, and me and my friend hauled my giant player in there and started running these Japanese animations, and the room filled up with people. They couldn't believe it. One of those people was Fred Patton. Fred Patton was a fan historian, not just furry, but science fiction, anime, fantasy, all that. He was tied in with Lossless, and after we'd run the tape several times with even people like Larry Niven and Jerry Pornell rooting for the giant robots, he said, we should do a screening at the Lossless Clubhouse once a month. So we started doing that, and through my friend Wendell, I met a guy named Robin Lydon and a lady named Judy Niver. Robin Lydon had taped Astro Boy off the air, black and white, when he was working on a job in Atlanta. It was the last station in the U.S. broadcasting that show before it went off the air. He gave us his tapes, we copied them. He had a friend named Mark Kausler who was a film collector. He would put 16mm reels together to show at Lossless, and he said, I'll show these at your meetings. So the five of us sat down at a table in a park in Burbank and said, we're going to start a club. And Fred and Judy said, well, animation is kind of an insider term back then, so we'll call it the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, because we're also going to show Japanese live-action fantasy series, like what eventually became Power Rangers. Still has meetings. It has a really good Facebook page with lots of information about Japanese animation and manga also. But the club went on for like 20 years, and at one point there were 10 chapters all around the country.
We mentioned the New York chapter for a bit, and they also had their own unique mascot as well.
Yeah, the New York chapter, one of the founders, that was Ken Sample, who was one of the first people who I think broke the mold on furry art by creating animal characters that just weren't people with animal heads on them. Really nice designs. And he created an animal called Anima, who was a fell insect, a little flying furry thing with dragonfly wings for the New York chapter. And some famous people went to those meetings, and it even turned out that the co-founder of the New York chapter went on to become the president of ASIFA Hollywood. It's weird how things do, kind of circle around. And it was me and June Foray, the famous voice actress, who was the president of ASIFA back then when I was hanging out with the club, that kept pushing and pushing them to look at Japanese animation, because they were looking at US animation, European animation. They weren't looking at Japan at all. And years later, Miyazaki won Best Picture in their own awards, which are called the Anima, the Annie Awards. So it finally happened. They finally looked at Japan.
There we go. All right. So after these anime clubs started becoming very, very big, the next natural step is, having room parties at these cons. Eventually, these anime con room parties will get so big that, hey, why don't we just form our own con? And what's interesting is, as opposed to all these other conventions that seem to get their start in New York City, the title of first anime con, there are at least three different groups that could kind of claim to be the first anime con in America, and all of them seem to be based out of Dallas for some reason. So the Dallas Fantasy Fair is the first that says it's the first con to focus on anime as a subsection, but it didn't focus on anime specifically. The first con to claim that focused completely on anime was YamanaCon in 1983. This was a one-day event, so it's interesting because, like I said, a lot of these early science fiction cons were one-day events, and the first Comic-Con was a one-day event. But for some reason, most people don't consider YamanaCon, even though because it was a one-day event, the first anime con. And I kind of agree a little bit with their definition because, like I said, if you use the WorldCon model, the hotel model convention, over the course of 3 days, the first one that could be considered that would be ACON in 1990. In fact, ACON YamanaCon was also held in the same hotel in Dallas as well. So Project ACON was held in the Richardson Hilton, and most people consider this the very first anime con in the United States, and it will import a lot of elements from the Japanese comiquettes. So, BayCon was the major science fiction con of the San Francisco Bay Area, and this is where we start gaining the birth of a lot of major groom parties focused around anime fans and furries, and they were so overwhelmed by the anime fans and furries they said, hey, get out of our space, form your own convention.
What happened was we kept having room parties at science fiction conventions. Every convention we could get to. Many of them happened at a convention called BayCon in San Jose. And
so talk about BABSCon, the Brony convention I was at last weekend. They also have a room party tradition. They also came from that BayCon family.
Yeah, they were BayCon people started that convention too. Anime was getting huge at that point. The CFO had expanded. A lot of people were importing stuff from Japan. We were getting newer shows, better copies, and some of the people were even cutting deals to sell VHS copies in this country with the studios. What happened is they kept asking for convention space at science fiction cons like BayCon to screen anime. And they would make beautiful 200-page books explaining the shows because they weren't subtitled. They weren't dubbed either. And literally they took over BayCon. And at some point BayCon said, guys, we'd kind of like our function space back. Can you go off and do your own thing? So the following year was the first anime convention in San Francisco.
So the anime fans were kind of the first to break out and try to create their own conventions. And the first major anime con that had a big influence was AnimeCon in 1991. It was held in San Jose. It was the first anime con to break 1,000 attendees, and eventually it will be rebranded as Anime Expo, which is still currently the largest anime con in the United States. A lot of stuff they would adapt is first, they would import that artist alley that Comic-Con created, the fan art artist alley over to America. And now this becomes a little tricky because now you have fans selling, fan art that's technically not legal at these events, but becomes such a big tradition that, most people turn a blind eye to it, but you still see groups like Funimation coming down and handing out, the cease and desist letters to a lot of fan artists during this period. So now you have artist alleys in the United States that are filled primarily with fan artists. In fact, a lot of anime cons here in America want you to have fan art. And in fact, if you don't have enough fan art, you might not be accepted. So during this period, the first anime con to break 1,000 attendees is AnimeCon, held in San Jose. Because it went in the red and went bankrupt, they had to reform. So the group that kind of took over it was kind of the same group, but legally they were a distinct business, was Anime Expo the following year. Anime Expo kept the con in the same hotel and eventually moved to the Los Angeles area and became the first anime con to pass 5,000 attendees in 1999. Then in 2001, 10,000 attendees, and then 100,000 attendees in 2016. And Anime Expo is still the largest anime con here in North America. Now, another splinter group from this original anime con was Anime America, which was a rival con in Santa Clara. And the year after AnimeCon folded, it moved into the exact same hotel AnimeCon used to be held in. So a number of notable cons that happened around this period. were Otakon, which is now based in Washington, D.C., but previously in Baltimore, Maryland. You had Fanime, which I would say is another successor to this entire family tree that is still held in San Jose. Then you have Anime Central, also known as ACEN, in Chicago. And like I said, it adapts a lot of the elements of Comic Con, including the Artist Alley, and most importantly, the Japanese style of raves and concerts. Because up to this point, now I said we had folk music, and sometimes we might have folk concerts, but we never had concerts on the level that we had in North America until the anime cons brought that style of rave concerts over here as well. So going back to the original anime con, you can kind of see the evolution of how it splintered off into Anime Expo and Anime America. And after this group folded and Anime Expo moved to Los Angeles, Fanime was founded and basically filled that same location in the San Jose area. And like I said, Anime Expo still was the largest anime con. You could see it really dwarfs all its other competitions. You can see it really trails ahead of all its next competitors. So Otakon and Akon, Anime Central, Anime Expo has kind of held the reins for the longest time, but I do want to put a caveat. Counting attendance numbers are really, really tricky. Like each con counts their attendance differently. Anime Expo uses turnstile, so basically, you know, the turnstile model, while for example, San Diego Comic-Con counts their attendance by registered membership, while New York Comic-Con counts it by badges sold per day. So it's very, very hard. That's why I don't really specifically focus on attendance, because it's a little bit tricky. It's like, yeah, you hands up quickly.
I'm just wondering what happened around 2012 that it just skyrocketed all of a sudden.
I have some theories, so we're going to get to that when we get to that period, but we'll eventually get there. But so in comparison, here is a Comic-Con. Comic-Con still is basically 3 times larger than all the anime cons. It's really weird because you see this, like, it seems like furry cons are 3 times larger than Brony cons, and anime cons are 3 times larger than furry cons, and comic cons are 3 times larger than anime cons, and then Comic Con is 3 times larger than comic cons. I'm not sure why it's in multiples of 3, but that's just something I kind of noticed over the years. So let's go back to that prancing skill tier organization with the Cartoon Fantasy organization. So the Cartoon Fantasy organization, their main thing was to distribute these bootleg anime VHSs to all these different room parties, to all these different conventions, all these different clubs. Now that anime cons are a thing, they now have access to more official, anime releases. So now the organization of the Cartoon Fantasy organization doesn't really have its original purpose, but it's still one to continue on going. So one of the other things the members of the Cartoon Fantasy organization noticed is that they were fans of anthropomorphic animals. In fact, their mascot was an anthropomorphic animal. Mark created his skill tier, which is an original species, kind of like an alien space weasel, as the mascot of the prancing skill tier, which is basically the house that he has that kind of is the catalog for a lot of the stuff. This is where a lot of the old furry gatherings were going. In fact, if you actually look at the cover of the fandom documentary, you can see it's a modernized take of the skill tier character.
So it's called the Cartoon Fantasy Organization, CFO. And they liked my critters, Skill Tear. And I had used Skill Tear. Yeah, the animal with the antenna there.
It was one of the first original species in the fandom, and OCs are very important. So the fact that
I made those when I was in high school because I got tired in Star Trek of all the aliens looking like humans. all the intelligent aliens were humans. I thought I'm gonna make one that's an intelligent weasel. So that was where they came from.
And if you ever wondered, that's the exact same creatures on the fandom documentary as well, the cover of the fandom documentary.
Yeah, which they didn't tell me they were going to do. That was a surprise. I saw the first picture of the poster, I went, what? So they said, well, Theta is your skill tier. That's Theta up in the top corner there, the gray and blue one with the yellow chest.
Oh, yeah.
He's your skill tier. Make a skill tier for our club that's a different skill tier, and that is the one on the business card. That's Fanta.
Right.
And her partner was Cy, and one of the people in the club was my girlfriend, and I used to call her Fanta, and she started calling me Cy. Everybody started calling me Cy, and I thought, I kind of like that, so that'll be me.
And this is where we start having the prancing skill tier parties. While anime fans were having their own parties at the science fiction cons, the furry side of the cartoon fantasy organization decided to have anthropomorphic specific room parties. And at WesternCon, this is where we get the first funny animal fan party in 1985, and eventually by the following year the term furry will be coined, and we eventually get the birth of the furry community. And one of the things I've been trying to stress the importance of the early part of the panel was talking about the room party floor, how room parties were very, very important for the cons around the time. And you were helping with the Prancing Skill Tier parties.
Yeah, what happened was we went to WesternCon, which is a regional science fiction convention that moves around depending on who bids on it. Happened to be in Sacramento that year in this Red Lion Hotel, had huge rooms, really nice rooms. We couldn't afford the rooms. We were across the street in a cheap motel. My good friend said, "Hey, why don't you guys throw a room party in our room tonight?" And I'm going, "Okay, about what?" "Well, drag out your videotapes, your Warner Brothers cartoons, and that Animal Olympics thing you taped, and all that artwork people send you, just lay it out and display it." And I said, "Oh." He said, "Yeah, call it a Prancing Skill Tear party." That Prancing Skill Tear was the name I gave my house based on a pub name. It was actually kind of based on the Prancing Pony from Lord of the Rings. And that little logo in the bottom corner is the logo for the house.
And
so
this was before the term furry was even coined, so these were called the funny animal parties.
The term furry didn't exist yet. One of my roommates was to blame for that, and he wasn't even a furry. He was into D&D when the people in Las Vegas started having meetings because they collected plush animals. They called themselves fuzzy fans. So at the time I was living there with several roommates, we were all into these animal characters, and he made up the term furry fans for us. And it kind of escaped. So we're stuck with it. Like Rodney says, it's easier to say than anthropomorphic.
Now, the furry community comes about in a lot of different groups. So like I said, we have the early zines. We have also the online group Furry Muck, which is also a big thing, but because we're a convention-focused panel, we're going to focus on the convention side with the Prancing Skill Tier parties. Eventually, again, becoming so big, they were like, okay, we can host our own convention. So as a test run, Mark and Rod decided to organize Conference Zero in 1989. So technically, they beat the anime cons by 1 year. So technically, the first Furry Con happened a year before the first anime con. But it had a modest attendance. It wasn't like the Star Trek cons where it had like 3,000 attendees. The first year had 65 attendees. But what's unique about it is it really kept the science fiction con model. While the Comic Cons and anime cons, when they branched off the science fiction cons, were kind of reinvent the wheel and try to do their own things, the furry cons kind of kept the science fiction model near identical. So the hotel room rate model, the staffing model, the party floor model, the art show, even the hospitality suite. If you go to a lot of these older cons, they would still have a hospitality suite, which is a really sci-fi con thing.
So the following year was the first anime convention in San Francisco, which corresponded to Rodney, my partner, saying to me, "So, do you think we can have a convention for furries?" And I said, "Well, I'll give it a try." So same year, we Conference Zero in Costa Mesa. And we just kept promoting it. We put flyers at comic stores. There was this really cool magazine phone book, fandom phone book, called the Fandom Directory. And you could buy mailing lists from them. They had thousands of people in their directory. And you could say, "I want a mailing list of everybody that's into cartoons, animation, funny animals," and they would send it to you. And you could print labels and mail stuff out. So we started mailing out postcards. "You want to come to a furry convention?" And 100 people signed up and 65 showed up. And Rodney and I said, "We'll do it again." And again, and again, and again. For 11 years, 8 of which was there was exactly one furry convention in the whole world, and that was Conference.
And I have a chart here of some of the early ones. So we have it in Costa Mesa. It moved to Anaheim, and it seems like it moved back to Costa Mesa, then Irvine, Buena Park, and then San Diego. So
Yeah.
it's like you moved around a bit. And you can see it was also the first FurryCon to cross the 1,000 attendee mark. So the equivalent we're talking about, Anime Expo was the first anime con to cross that number. Conference was the first to kind of cross that mark as well. And another thing I want to point out is because when you create a conference, you gleaned a lot of the model that the sci-fi cons also had, while anime cons and comic cons kind of made their own model, kind of shed off some of the sci-fi roots. It seems like these early furry cons kept a lot of the same models: the hotel block model, the staffing model, the one guest of
staffing
honor,
model,
the programming track.
The way the programming track worked, the costume presentation. The anime conventions became more like trade shows, like comic conventions.
And some of the other stuff you kept, kind of the hospitality suite, which I would argue eventually evolved into the zoo after they got rid of the food that was normally served in the hospitality suite. But most importantly was keeping the room party floor, which I said, again, most of these conventions were born on the room party floor. So I think it was very important that the furry cons kept that tradition, which is why afterwards I would say, go check out the room parties here at this convention, because who knows what type of new cons will get born from these types of room parties. Like I said, the furry cons kind of kept a lot, but they eventually started to evolve in their own way. So the dealer's hall at these old science fiction cons will eventually become the dealer's den as we know them today. The hospitality suites will eventually become the zoo. Cosplay lounge becomes the headless mount lounge that we have for the fursuiters. But what's most important was the masquerade. Like I said, the masquerade was the big staple event at science fiction cons held Saturday evening. Now, these early furry cons decided, because costuming is a big part of the furry community, they decided to move the masquerade from Saturday evening to Saturday afternoon. Now, the problem is having it at Saturday afternoon means the dealers would not be able to see the fursuiters. So after the masquerade was done, they would march all the fursuiters through the dealer's den, and basically this will evolve to become the fursuit parade.
What happened was, at a convention called Method Fur Meet, a lot of dealers didn't have people to help them. They ran their tables by themselves. And the fursuits would be in a presentation, and they never got to see any of them. Not everybody wore their fursuits around the convention. Some people just put them on the presentation, took them back off again. So somebody thought this great idea of, okay, when we get ready to take the picture of all the fursuiters, before we do, we'll have them march through the dealer's room. And everybody thought this was a great idea. It's like, well, why not have them march through the whole hotel? Or march down the street in front of the hotel, and it just went up from there.
So nowadays, most fur cons no longer have the masquerade, but they kept the fursuit parade element that came from the masquerade. So you can kind of see the evolution of what furry cons took from the science fiction cons. And you can see that compared to the anime cons and comic cons, the furries kind of kept a lot of the elements of the science fiction con scene. This will also bring in a little bit of problems, but let's focus on some of the early furry cons first before I move on to that period. So Conference was specifically held around the Los Angeles area, and it started to grow in attendance. So this is what I took specifically from WikiFur. After its 10th con, they decided to step down, and an individual who took over was a Burnfur. Burnfurs we're going to get into a little bit later, but they also played a big role. And we could kind of see that as kind of like when Conference also had its decline. Now, during this time, the term conference kind of became a genericized term for a furry con. So if we think about Comic-Con, Comic-Con is a genericized term for a comic convention. Before we had the term FurCon or FurryCon, a conference was a genericized term for a furry con. So you start seeing a lot of conferences happening around the country that were not associated with the original event. One of the major ones was Conference East, which was founded in 1994, and it was kind of formed because they kind of overwhelmed their local convention, PhilCon. Remember one of the contenders being the first con? PhilCon, again, overwhelmed by furries, stopped accepting furry artists in their dealer's hall, and for their art show, furries kind of felt unwanted, so they left and eventually formed their own group, Conference East. Some of the interesting elements, because you talked about how I guess it was the furry stuff was kind of overwhelming BABSCon, the anime stuff was overwhelming BABSCon, which is why they had to kind of branch off. And it seemed like the very similar situation was happening out in the East, where a lot of the furries were kind of overwhelming PhilCon. You had in the Midwest, a lot of the furries were overwhelming Duck, and that eventually would give way to Midwest Furfest and Conference East, which was kind of the forerunner to what eventually became AnthroCon. And I actually was curious because it seems like a lot of cons use conference and were not connected because Conference East was not connected to your conference,
They
right?
just asked us if they could use the name.
So back then, I was guessing, was the term conference like the genericized term for a FurryCon back then?
It became that, but not on purpose.
Okay.
That came from the fact that science fiction cons like to have their names as word puns that had the word con in them. You know, conflagration, conception, leprechaun, you know, those were all, you know. So we were going to actually call our convention Califer, interestingly enough. Why not call it conference, but F-U-R? And we went, yeah, that's kind of cool. So we did that. And then we ended up with Eurofurence, Russfurence, there's now Canfurence, kind of similar in Guadalajara, Mexico, the biggest convention in Mexico, Conferrer.
Conference East. It was originally held in November, and a lot of people thought, oh, that was too cold for attendees, so not much people are going to go there, so let's move it to another weekend. I'll tell that to Midwest Furfest, which is held during that period, and it's the largest furry con. So after that con moved out, it eventually became replaced with Albany AnthroCon, which is held over July 4th weekend, so very similar to the first World Con. And Albany AnthroCon invited an individual named Dr. Conway, also known as Uncle Kage, as the first guest of honor. He entered as guest of honor and left as the chairman for Albany AnthroCon, and has been the chair of that con since. So you can kind of see that evolution between Conference East eventually giving way to Albany AnthroCon, dropping Albany from its name and just becoming AnthroCon. Under Uncle Kage, AnthroCon was then moved to Philadelphia in 2001, and it was nicknamed StairCon because the elevators were kind of broken, so they had to use the stairs a lot. But you know, Elevator Con kind of has become a thing at a lot of furry cons lately as well. Uncle Kage also, again, was an attendee at PhilCon, and PhilCon, like these science fiction cons, these old science fiction cons were still business-run events. And a lot of these science fiction cons have it in their constitution that they could help fund small, startup events. And so technically, PhilCon could help fund this early AnthroCon, and Uncle Kage came, and as he tells it, he went to a PhilCon meeting, asked for money for AnthroCon. They said, you have to get on your knees and beg. He literally got on his knees and begged. He was like, okay, fine, and they gave him money. So with their assistance, AnthroCon moved to Pittsburgh, and then eventually to Philadelphia, and then eventually the city of Pittsburgh started to petition AnthroCon to move there. Initially, Uncle Kage did not like the idea of moving to Pittsburgh. He thought it was still like a horrible studio city, that there's no reason why AnthroCon should move. Eventually, after being convinced, he checked out the area and thought, okay, great. And now AnthroCon's in Pittsburgh, where it has such a strong relationship with the city, that I would even argue that Pittsburgh and AnthroCon are even tighter than Comic-Con in San Diego at this point. Another thing Uncle Kage tried to do is start helping, change the perception. So we have to remember the atmosphere around the time. So when the Trekkies came about back in the 70s, this was kind of the birth of the local news cycle. So we had nothing really to report on the local news. It's like, oh, there's a convention in town, people are dressed in funny outfits, let's kind of report on that. So they kind of took just the bare basics of what these cons were and just reported, oh, people are dressed in funny outfits, not really talking about the fantastic, philosophical panels they might be hosting, talking about the fantastic fan art. Oh, people in funny outfits. Fast forward to the 90s, when the furry cons are coming out, we get the birth of the 24-hour news cycle. And then what happens when there's nothing on the news? Okay, people dressed in outfits at the hotel, dressed as funny animals. What are they doing behind the scenes? Now the problem is, when the furries started to do this, they decided to isolate themselves from the media, and a lot of these furry cons will blacklist media. In fact, if you read the con books, like if you even talk or associate yourself with the media, give them pictures, you'll be blacklisted from their cons. So that, I think, had an unintentional effect where they were trying to purposely avoid the bad PR from the media, that then made the media curious. Why are they blocking us from their events? Are they doing something suspicious there? So unfortunately, furries got a lot of flack for doing this. And then fast forward another 2 decades, and the Bronies came about during the rise of online journalism, and the Bronies suffered the exact same thing that Trekkies and the furries did as well. So, under Uncle Kage, he was trying to sanitize the furry fandom, I guess, as they would say, trying to make it more family-friendly. During this time, the furry community was very adult, very queer-focused, queer-oriented. So to kind of make it more family-friendly, he had to change some things. So originally, the furry cons adapted something from the science fiction cons and called it a pet auction. I guess Uncle Kage thought it sounded a little more raunchy and retitled that as a charity auction, and that becomes now a default. Almost every single furry con now has a charity auction, and most cons formed after furry cons have a charity auction. Though to be fair, I think the pet auction is a much better name than what the science fiction cons called it. They originally called it a slave auction, so at least pet auction was much more friendlier than that. The next major con to kind of come out of this was Midwest Furfest. Let's repeat the exact same story. So, DuckCon, their local science fiction con, eventually overwhelmed by furries. Hey, do your own event. Exact same story over again. In fact, it was so funny that the furry track, so again, the programming track with the themed panel rooms, the furry track outgrew DuckCon to the point that they eventually left, made Midwest Furfest, held their own independent event, and then DuckCon started seeing the attendance drop. It's like, oh, I guess most of our attendees were actually furries. Let's try to get some furries back. So a few years later, they eventually invited Uncle Kage as their guest of honor to try, hey, let's get some of our furry friends back. So AnthroCon and Midwest Furfest are important because these are going to be the cons that will hold the reins for some of the record-breaking attendance numbers. So AnthroCon was the first furry con to break 5,000 attendees. It took them a few years. In 2012 is when they finally broke the 5,000 attendee mark. And then Midwest Furfest surpassed AnthroCon in 2018 with 10,000 attendees. Though if we consider Bronies a type of furry, then technically the Brony cons beat that number first, but we'll get to that when we get to the furries. Alright, so like we were saying, there is some controversy in the furry community during this time period. Furries are a queer-focused community a lot, and sometimes a lot of things that the furries did during this period might be considered too adult and not family-friendly. So you have a group called the Denfur, which are trying to counteract public access reversion and try to make a much friendlier image for the furry community, a more family-friendly image. The problem is the Denfurs would basically target almost everything. Like they would rightfully target like Nazi furs, but then they would target LGBT content, different kinks, Christian furs, so they're very mismatched of what they want to target. And eventually they got a bad name for themselves, renamed themselves as Improved Anthropomorphics. And this is where we get into something that you might notice, that something that's kind of brushed over in the course of furry history, but you get the term anthro used as an alternative to furry. Now, some people saw this as like, okay, we are not furries, but we like anthropomorphic artwork, so we're going to call ourselves anthro. It's a much more sanitized version of furry. And so again, it's not consistent of why some groups call themselves that, but a lot of old school founders of conference and old school staffers would say Albany AnthroCon initially called themselves an AnthroCon to distance themselves from the furries.
And the original old guard, who were fans that took the fact that they had artists that they circled around is very important. All these new people suddenly showed up, and a few of those people didn't like the fact that a lot of the new people were LGBT. So some of those people said, we've got to stop this. We've got to clean up furry fandom, i.e. get the gay people out. So they decided to split the fandom up, or tried to, by saying there's furry fandom, bad, and anthro fandom, good.
And then later on, we start seeing more conservative leaning conventions like Anthro Northwest and use Anthro in their title. And of course, we had a horrible free-for-all happening, which also used Anthro. But it's not completely one-to-one. So for example, Anthro Expo and Anthro New England, I would argue, are also more on the or the opposite side of the spectrum, but they still use Anthro in their title. So it's not one per one, but sometimes you will see Anthro used specifically as an alternative to furry during this period as well. Before I actually move on to the next type of furry cons that are starting to form, going back to the old school science fiction con model. Now, the issue with this is paired with now the furry community kind of isolating themselves. So if you think about the volunteer scene for conventions during this period, who here volunteers at cons? So if you volunteer at cons, you're most likely in a local community that likes to volunteer on a lot of different cons. So for example, I went to university in Baltimore. Baltimore, you have Oldacon, Baltimore Comic-Con, BaltCon, BronyCon, and you'll see the same staffers staff at all these different cons. They might not be a fan of all these different events, but they just love staffing conventions. And because of this is where you get kind of the evolution of how to organize and run your events, improve lines, improve badge pickup, improve panels. And ironically enough, because the furry cons during this period, they took the 90s science fiction con model, then isolated themselves. So for this period, for almost a decade, the furry cons would then stop inviting volunteers from different conventions because they felt, okay, they're going to make fun of us, they might have a secret agenda, so let's try to run these events ourselves. And because of that, the furry cons are kind of in a state of stagnation. It's ironic because the furries were the most tech savvy and the staffers during this time period, but even when I started attending my first furry cons in like 2015, 2016, they were still using the exact same science fiction con model which was created in the 90s, using old, computers for badge pickup, old systems for the lines. They had really outdated methods. So for example, because most science fiction cons are so small, you can easily just leave a panel room open and don't even have AV staff. Most furry cons, even though they're now in 5,000 to 10,000 attendance mark, where you should be having an AV staffer in the room helping with paneling and stuff, most furry cons do not do this. Furry cons also have long badge pickup lines because they took this model that was created in the 90s for cons that only had a few hundred attendees, now scale it up to furry cons surpassing the 5,000 attendee mark, and it just does not scale. So it's ironic because the furries are trying to protect themselves from outside drama. They kind of remained in this isolated bubble for almost 2 decades before they kind of started coming out or shout in I would say 2016, 2017 period. Because once these furry cons started hitting these large numbers, that was the only way to kind of improve.
Most furry cons have also kept the outdated model for programming. If you go to programming at an AnimeCon or Comic-Con, there's normally like a 15-minute or 30-minute break in between. You also have staff in the room helping run AV and stuff. At most furry cons still, the panels run back to back. You don't have staff coming in to clear out rooms, and you don't have AV staff on hand to help you out. So stuff like that. Furry cons were almost kind of held back. They're kind of like, you go to a small Amish town. It was kind of like that in the con scene for the longest time until the furry cons started to open up and reintegrate into the different community.
So some of the major furry cons created during this period. So we have Further Confusion. Further Confusion is one of the reasons why a lot of people think Conference was also killed. It was a California con that kind of took that winter slot, the January slot that Further Confusion used to have. Further Confusion still kind of has that old school science fiction con model. So like I said, it still has an art show, it still has a party floor. Megaplex, where I live now in Orlando, was another con that was started. Then we have Furry Weekend Atlanta, which is now currently the 3rd largest furry con. And then Furry Fiesta, which was started in Dallas. So these are some of the major cons. Now, let's go back to the 90s. So you have the furry cons kind of evolving during the 90s, but let's go back to the comic cons. So this is a period called comic boom and bust. So basically, black and white indie comics like Ninja Turtles all of a sudden started making a lot of money. So a lot of people try to jump in the market. There was a big speculators market. Think Beanie Babies, think NFTs. boom and bust. All of a sudden, a lot of comic book stores had to close, a lot of comic book companies had to close. But during the speculators market, there was a lot of people trying to predict the price of comics. So you have groups like Wizard Magazine with price guides trying to predict that stuff. Then we get this period where you have the rise of the internet, and now you have comics on the internet. So this is where you get the rise of web comics. Specifically, Penny Arcade was a really, really big one that dealt with video games, the rise of video games during this period. And then you start to see cons now shifting from being more volunteer run to being professionally owned events. So for the longest time, these cons were run by volunteers. These are nonprofit events, unpaid staffers, and now you want to make cons more professional. So the first one I want to blame is Fan Expo in Canada.
So this is where we get a period called the comics boom and bust. Basically, Dark Horse Comics, Ninja Turtles, all that stuff, speculators market. So basically think Beanie Babies, but with comics, think NFTs, but with comics. But this is also where you get a lot of people trying to corporatize and run cons professionally. Like we had Creation Con with the Star Trek cons back in the 70s, but it was really during this period where it happened. And I think I have to thank you Canadians for this, because you Canadians created something called Fan Expo Canada. Fan Expo Canada then decided to go around the United States and buy up some of the oldest running science fiction and comic cons, and then just turn them into a corporate rebranding of Fan Expo. So for example, Dallas Comic Con was bought by Fan Expo and just rebranded as Fan Expo Dallas. And you start seeing this happening again and again, these fan-run cons being bought up by these large corporations and rebranded. Wizard Magazine used to be a speculator magazine on comic prices, essentially bought Chicago Comic Con, one of the oldest Comic Cons in the United States, and rebranded it as Wizard World Chicago. Then essentially, I think Wizard World was then just bought out by Fan Expo, so now Wizard World Chicago is now Fan Expo Chicago. So you start seeing this entire movement of trying to corporatize cons, and that becomes a little bit tricky.
Penny Arcade, the webcomic, decided to create Penny Arcade Expo, which then really shifted how video game cons were done, because for most of the period, video games were shown at electronic trade shows, so trade shows are a completely different animal from conventions. But after Penny Arcade came on the scene, most of these video game events would then shift more towards a Comic-Con model and shift away from the trade show model. And this is where we get into the growth of San Diego Comic-Con. So I have a theory. So you start seeing, so even up to this period, you could still go up to San Diego Comic-Con the day of the event and buy a ticket and walk in. Nowadays, if you try to go to San Diego Comic-Con, you have to buy the ticket the literal second it opens, because they sell within seconds if you try to buy a ticket online. So what happened? My theory is you have two big movies come out around the same period. You have The Dark Knight, and then you have Iron Man. And that kind of shifted the entire superhero cinematic franchise thing. Mainly, you had a big A-list actor like Robert Downey Jr. going to a fan event and promoting Iron Man, which was a big change, because up to this point, most of your actors you will see at these events would be kind of washed up B or C-list actors. Basically, if you go to any horror convention, you have something called the Celebrity Zoo, where you have washed up horror movie actors kind of just signing autographs, and that was the state of things then. But all of a sudden you have a change where, an A-list actor, a Hollywood actor is actually coming to our event. That's going to make a lot of people want to go to your event. And this is just a theory, but if you do look at the sales, after this period with Robert Downey Jr. going to San Diego Comic-Con promoting his event, instantly Comic-Con attendance increased. And basically, you can't buy tickets anymore because they sell out within seconds. And so this is just my theory, but I think it kind of has some truth to it. Another major event, New York Comic Con, separate from the original New York Comic Con founded by school kids, was started. Interesting enough, the two founders of New York Comic Con, do I have it here? The two founders of New York Comic Con split ways. One of them decided to work for Repop. The other one decided to form his own group called Left Field Media, which started AwesomeCon. What's funny enough is in the Pacific Northwest, you had two fan-run Comic Cons, Emerald City Comic Con, Rose City Comic Con. Repop bought Emerald City Comic Con, Left Field bought Rose City Comic Con. So it's interesting, it split these two cons, even though it kept the near identical logos. Then when they started to move on to anime cons, Repop decided to create Crunchyroll Expo, while Left Field decided to create Anime Cons powered by Crunchyroll. So it's this weird, incestuous nature of two corporate convention organizations trying to, one outcompete each other.
All right, so this moves into the next major scene. So we talked about furries, we talked about Trekkies, and the love child of these two would be the Bronies. So let's talk a little about the BronyCons, because technically you could argue Bronies are a subsection of furries. If that's the case, then that means the BronyCons play a much more important role than what we think. But very, very quick summary. Lauren Faust in 2010 rebooted My Little Pony, which in its 4th generation, it was a long-time Hasbro franchise that had 3 different previous incarnations. Lauren Faust was involved in a period called the Animation Renaissance. The Animation Renaissance was marked by fantastic cartoons during the 90s and early 2000s, mainly on Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, and the Disney Channel. Then you have a period of kind of an animation recession when Flash animation kind of took wave and quality of animation kind of became cheaper. This is where you get your Seth MacFarlane knockoffs and your Johnny Test. Then, in 2010, when My Little Pony had its reboot, this was also the same time when Adventure Time kind of came about, and it started a new wave of animation called the Animation Revival. Bronies kind of came from a specific source. You had a group on 4chan /co. Again, nowadays 4chan is kind of seen as a little controversial, but back then you have to remember 4chan was just a regular board for people to kind of gather and interact with each other. Unfortunately, there was an online blog around this con called Cartoon Brew. The guy was probably a sexist because he called out Lauren Faust. Before My Little Pony even aired, he called Lauren Faust's My Little Pony the death of creator-driven television. I don't know where he was when the Seth MacFarlane clones came out, but for some reason he had to call Lauren Faust. A lot of these 4chan members, they were basically college students, millennials who grew up during the animation renaissance. They really wanted to support Lauren Faust because, hey, she worked on fantastic shows like Powerpuff Girls and Foster's Home. So 4chan kind of organized watch parties for the first My Little Pony show to kind of show support for Lauren Faust. And during these early watch parties, like, oh, this is actually a really, really good show, because you have to remember now reboots of these properties are a dime a dozen. But what Lauren Faust did with her reboot My Little Pony was really, really unique for this period. They started identifying with a lot of characters. They adopted a dirt glide character in the background called Derby Hooves, and it kind of became the mascot of this new group of My Little Pony fans. Then eventually the term Brony was coined, and boom, we got the start of the Brony fandom. Back then, people were criticizing that Bronies, why is it more predominantly male? But as you see, they might have been male then, but the Bronies nowadays are mainly trans women. So that was something that people were not noticing back then. Okay, so we kind of got that foundation. All right, so trans people, very, very important with the foundations of the Brony fandom, because the very first pony convention was founded by a trans individual named Purple Tinker. She was a fan of Star Trek, she was a fan of the Furrycons, and she basically decided to create her first pony convention as a hybrid between a furry and a Star Trek con. So taking the model of the Furrycons, mashing it up with the guest model of a Star Trek convention. Boom, you got BronyCon, again, founded in New York in 2011, being the first type of convention of its type, and it created a new kind of system for these conventions. All right, then we have something that kind of bring up. So there's a bunch of cons forming around the country during this period. Some of the major conventions will include Nightmare Nights, which was founded by some of the staffers of Furry Fiesta in Dallas. You would have Everfree Northwest in Seattle, which is still currently running and now is the oldest furry Brony convention and still the largest Brony convention after the original BronyCon died. BABSCon, like I said, with the help of the BABSCon people, founded in San Francisco. And from the early BronyCon, you started to see a boom of PonyCons happening around the country. And it got so crazy, you were having more Brony conventionings happening in the United States than you had Doctor Who, Harry Potter, SpongeBob, The Last Avatar, Steven Universe, Star Trek cons happening combined. So the fact you have one fandom with like 30 cons happening a year is just kind of insane and crazy. And something is going to burst, and eventually it did with an event called Las Vegas Unicon. So this is the Bronies Con. This is the Bronies Rainforest, and basically it was run by some suspicious individuals. I don't even think they were Bronies. They actually ran a group, when you bring like balloons and reptiles to a kid's birthday party, that was basically the couple that founded Las Vegas Unicon. Long story short, it was very, very controversial. They invited a bunch of big guests, big name voice actors, Lauren Faust, John Delancey to the show. Then all of a sudden they couldn't pay them. Autograph money started being stolen. Sponsors who spent thousands of dollars for big suite hotel rooms were being kicked out of hotel rooms. Dealers couldn't even handle money and were given these paper play money that they had to exchange at the end, but they couldn't even exchange. Basically, the entire con imploded, and this could have been the end for BronyCons as we know it, because if you remember, Bronies are technically doing a con that's based around a franchise that they have no legal rights to. So the reason why Harry Potter cons aren't a thing is because Warner Bros. And J.K. Rowling came and put the damn hammer down, no more Harry Potter cons. Hasbro at any con could have done this, and it was a very tricky situation for the Brony fandom. In fact, the Brony fandom could have ended during this period. In fact, you had a lot of different groups trying to fight each other for control over the Brony fandom, and they decided to unite together. Power of magic and friendship and save face. They did a fundraiser, boom, they saved the con. It's like, let's calm down and regroup and not let this happen again.
I do know that if Las Vegas had not happened, Hasbro would have banned all talent from attending pony conventions.
Yeah.
So the fandom basically saved itself without realizing they were doing that.
I think that was like not only the changing point in the BronyCon scene, but all the other cons, like not just BronyCons, Comic Cons, Anime Cons, Furry Cons had emergency meetings, and it gave birth to a department that Bronies were the first to create, the VIPR, Viper Guest Relations Department. VIPR Relations Department has now been adapted to a bunch of different cons. So after Unicon, not just all the BronyCons, a lot of anime cons, a lot of furry cons, a lot of comic cons, all had to do emergency meetings and kind of not repeat the mistake. So let's talk about how cons would be doing their staffing during this period. For the BronyCons, you have to remember how most cons were doing their convention staffing. So as opposed to the furry cons and science fiction cons, which had one guest of honor, during this period you had anime cons and comic cons have tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of guests of honor, and they would be shoved from autograph session to autograph signings to panels to signings to panels to signings. Oh, where are these people out? In fact, you get to the point where you have a lot of guests at these anime cons saying, I never want to go to this con again, it's just stressing me out. It's like, okay, fine, we have like hundreds of other VAs to pull from. We have hundreds of other comic book artists who would be happy to come to our cons. The tricky thing is, as Purple Tinker points out, you can't say the same thing for the Brony fandom, because you have to remember, the Brony fandom is actually even more unique than the Star Trek cons. The Star Trek cons are cons for the Star Trek fandom, and the Star Trek fandom includes all generations. The original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, all the way to the J.J. Abrams movies and the Paramount Plus shows. All that is part of Star Trek. You can pull a guest from any one of these franchises. My Little Pony fandom is really, really unique because the Bronies technically aren't even a fan of My Little Pony. They are a fan of one generation of My Little Pony. And these early cons were happening when you only had this show was still on its second and third season. So think about it. You have 6 main characters voiced by 4 VAs. 2 of them are notoriously hard to get. And you have 30 pony cons around the country fighting for these full handful of VAs. You're going to stress them out. So the Bronies had to shift the model and say, okay, we're not going to overwork these guests. We have to treat them with respect, make it like a vacation for them. And this is what the VIPR department was. Send out a nice van to pick them up at the airport, make sure they're not overworked. If they do seem tired, maybe cancel a panel, cancel the autograph signing, make sure they're very, very happy. This model has now been adapted by a lot of anime cons and comic cons, and some furry cons have adapted this model. Sometimes it's called the green room department, sometimes it's called guest relations department. So the BronyCons kind of introduced this new system to make sure the VIPs were enjoying themselves and not stressed out with long autograph lines and signings. So the BronyCons kind of made their mark, and you still see some BronyCons kind of dwindle down. So as opposed to having like 30 PonyCons happening around the country, they started like condensing to about less than 10 PonyCons in every major city. All right, the Bronies also introduced a lot of things en masse that would become adapted by different cons. So the Bronies were the first to actually introduce these communication tags. I remember when people were saying, "Oh, Midwest Furfest, interesting. They're unique for having these communication tags." Well, BronyCons are doing it 5 years before they were doing it. The BronyCons were also the first to introduce pronoun ribbons and gender-neutral bathrooms. Because you remember, most of these PonyCons, I think at least, I did the calculations, at least 60% of all the major PonyCons were founded or chaired by trans women. I also want to point out how many, just on the stage, all the people were talking about how influential the trans fans in the community have been in running PonyCons. Like, if we think about it, Purple Tinker founded the first BronyCon. Trans individual, almost every single con in this fandom has been founded or cheered by a trans individual, which I think is really, really cool, which is why I think the Bronies, the BronyCons on the whole, were really the first cons to adapt a lot of things like the gender-neutral bathrooms, the pronoun ribbons, the communication tags, and I think it was because of how, I guess, diverse our con running scene was compared to the other cons around the time.
Before, for the last BronyCon, I had a musician reach out to me and say, hey, I was a well-known musician in the fandom, but I'm trans, I changed my name, and I want to apply for Bronypalooza, but I'm kind of nervous, and like, I don't know how to communicate this, and I was like, our head of Bronypalooza is trans, I'm trans, the vice chair is trans, like literally the entire leadership is trans, like please do not worry, we have you, don't worry. So, and it's really cool though, and BronyCon, so you have a picture up there of the color communication card, so that was an idea pioneered by the Autism Self-Advocacy Network that our design leads picked up and ran with, and now I've seen replicated at several other conventions and furry events, maybe even a sci-fi event too. But I really love those badges. I wish they had, I wish they were a little more cost-effective to manufacture.
Yeah.
It's really what I wish, because they're such a great tool for communicating.
So because, the Bronies are so trans inclusive, it would make sense they would be the first to adapt gender-neutral bathrooms and pronoun ribbons en masse. And eventually this would make their way back to the furry side. So, to continue how the Bronies now were influenced by furries, and now Bronies are going to influence furries back, we have to talk about this group called Cutie Corral. They made these kind of weird looking plush, felt plush characters, and this group decided we need to have more PonyCons to sell at, so they decided to create their own group called Corgi Events, and they decided to create their own pony conventions. Ponyville Side Effects, which is still going on as long as Whinny City in Chicago, and eventually they realized, hey, we can actually make more money selling fursuits, so they went from selling pony plushies to making fursuits as Lemon Brat, and then they started to make a lot of their own furry cons, Denfur, Sin City Mercon, Quad Fur, Biggest Little Furcon. They even bought an anime con for a period. Long story short, they kind of imploded, and we don't need to get into that. But it's through Corgi Events that they introduce a lot of the Brony model of running cons back to the furry community, to the point where we're looking at what furries are doing now. A lot of furry cons now have communication tags, gender neutral bathrooms, and the pronoun ribbons. It's kind of through the furry staffers who migrated over to the furry cons that introduced a lot of these elements. And one of the other major things I would say that the Bronies introduced are the Brony styles of running concert, because Brony music is a very, very big thing in the Brony fandom. They take filk to a whole nother level. So you could argue that the Bronies have a renegade stage that's kind of a modern equivalent to like the filking room, and how Bronies, if you go to, it doesn't matter if it's a large BronyCon that has 10,000 attendees or a small PonyCon with a few hundred attendees, their concerts go all out. Lights, sound, animation. And if you notice, if you go to almost every single major furry con, like almost half the AV staff have been poached from the BronyCons. I think even for this con, as a joke, because they know how many Bronies are on AV staff, I think they have the Wi-Fi is like Bronies or diet furries, because they know how many Bronies are actually working this event. So we go to this period where we have the boom and rise of all these different cons, and now we get to this period of there's a lot of different cons happening, and you get to this split of, okay, you have the professional run cons and you have the fan run cons.
There's benefits, there's pros and cons for these cons. So for for-profit cons, you can hire more experienced individuals to run things. They have a better time selecting big-name musicians, panelists, and guests. And if a fire or drama starts at a big con, corporate con, they could be put out very easily. Most of these fires that these big cons could just brush over would kill a smaller fan-run convention. Now, this is where you get into the tricky areas with these professional for-profit cons. Because technically, volunteers would have to be paid if it's a for-profit con, but most of these big cons don't pay the volunteers, so it's a really great area there. Like I said, these cons become the cattle cons, where everyone's shoved in lines for the autographs and the panels.
Like I said, this is where you got worse mistreatment of guests, and unfortunately, this is also where you get these cons buying up the smaller cons. Now, the pros for the smaller fan-run cons are they're smaller, a few thousand attendees, sometimes just a few hundred. They're smaller, cozier, you can interact more intimately with the guests of honors. Like when I went to BALTICon, I could easily just go down to the bar and see George R.R. Martin there and just chat with them, and that's something you can't really get with a larger convention. And that's something that's really lost when you get to these bigger conventions. But these small nonprofit fan-run cons can also lead to what I call vanity cons. These are basically con cheer for life, where they fund the con and they create the con, and what they say goes. If you disagree with them, then you're fired. And when that person is canceled or falls, that con dies with them. And you see that a lot with these kind of vanities cons. The other time is, as fortunate as it says, because I volunteered at a lot of these cons, a lot of these volunteers did not have experience. When you have high school kids, think about it. Think about dealers, for example. These are people whose livelihoods are made up of these cons. These are the authors who work on big novels, like the artists who work on Superman, for example. Then you can have a high school kid says, well, I like your stuff, I don't like your stuff. You're in the vendor hall, you're not in the vendor hall. Isn't that crazy when you kind of think about it? So it's kind of weird that volunteers have so much power, but they might not have the experience, because when the fire happens, a bunch of high school kids don't know how to put out a fire, and that causes a lot of issues. So you kind of get the good and bad with both these cons. Going back to anime cons, where pro cons, where volunteer cons could also have issues. This is the first come first serve system for getting a table, an artist alley table at Anime Expo. As you can see, within 10 milliseconds, all the tables, first come tables at Anime Expo are bought up quickly, and I have to assume by bots because no one could type that fast. And Anime Expo, the biggest anime con, we'll use them as an example, had some issues as well. Like, for example, artists who are stuck in the artist alley for 10 hours cannot leave their tables, sometimes need to bring their food and water in to drink. And at Anime Expo last year, they had security just kind of confiscating all the food that they brought in and laughing about it and eating it, like, hey, thank you for giving us free lunch. So this is stuff that could cancel a small con, but because Anime Expo is the biggest anime con in the country, they could get away with it. Then you have the furry cons having to go through their own different phase as well. So this con we're at, Biggest Little Furcon, was founded in 2013. So I think around the 2013-2017 period is where you get the next major cons in the furry fandom being formed. Anthro New England, Rainforest, like I said, was kind of the furry version of DashCon, though I think a lot of people misinterpret what happened at Rainforest, and I think in retrospect, a lot of people treated Rainforest too harshly. It was then replaced by Anthro Northwest, which doesn't consider itself a furry con. We are an Anthro convention. We are a family-friendly Anthro convention, even though we have controversial artists do all our artwork, whatever. Similar situation happened with Rocky Mountain Furcon, which was called out for having a lot of alt-right elements. It was then replaced by Denfur, again, done by Crookie Events. But you have to notice this is a period where we have a bunch of different movements happening at the same period. So in the science fiction fandom, you have something called the Sad Puppies, which was a more conservative-leaning block voting to try to make more conservative works nominated for the Hugo Awards. Because during this period, a lot of Hugo Awards were being won by liberal, leftist, progressive authors, and a lot of the old school science fiction fans who were more conservative-leaning, like the more militaristic space operas, wanted to do a block voting where each category of the Hugo Awards, they will vote specifically for one conservative-leaning science fiction author. That then working eventually gave way to what was called the rabid puppy movements. Then you had ComicGate, you had Gamergate, you had the Me Too movement, a lot of controversial stuff. This is a love letter to conventions, not all the drama, so I'm not going to cover this in too much details, but a lot of cons had a lot of controversial issues during this period, and they had to be called out for that stuff. So, originally, when I was writing this book, when I was working on this book, when I was doing this panel, I wanted to end it in 2019. I thought that was a perfect year. It was the 80th Worldcon, it was the 50th San Diego Comic-Con, it was the final BronyCon. It was the perfect place to end the book. The Bronies were now, the show ended the exact same year, and a lot of the Bronies started to make their way over to the furry fandom, so that would be a perfect cap on the story, right? In fact, if you see, the Bronies have kind of made their way into a lot of different aspects of regular pop culture. So a lot of musicians like Living Tombstone are now kind of big outside the Brony fandom. Deadly Comics, he was actually the guest of honor for Furpop last year. You have my friend Ashley, who's now working on a lot of her own animated shows, and even some Brony YouTubers like Jenny and my friend Saberspark have now kind of made their way in becoming big outside the Brony community. So let's talk about Bronies and furries. So a lot of people would say, okay, Bronies are furries are not Bronies. So if we include Bronies into the categories of furries, so these are like the largest furry cons at the time when I did this panel originally. But if we include BronyCon, then technically BronyCon for at least 3 to 4 years would technically have been the largest furry convention, which is kind of interesting if we think of it that way. In fact, that would mean Midwest Furfest was not the first furry con to break 10,000 attendees. Technically, BronyCon would be the first furry con to break the 10,000 attendee marks 3 years before Midwest Furfest. So it's interesting because a lot of furries like to say, hey, Bronies are technically part of our fandom. If that's the case, then that means the Bronies were the ones breaking all the records. So looking at the chart, so here's BronyCon in blue and AnthroCon in red, which was the largest furry con for the longest period until it was surpassed by Midwest Furfest. So we can see between 2013 and 2016, BronyCon at least equaled or surpassed AnthroCon's numbers. And it only took until Midwest Furfest in 2018 to finally beat BronyCon's numbers. And then we had the pandemic there, but BronyCon at least ended on a high mark before. I think it ended at the right time, right before the pandemic.
Yeah, and BronyCon's identity was really like predicated on it being the biggest. So when it started to be not the biggest anymore, BronyCon had an identity crisis, which it turns out is very hard to solve. If any of you have ever experienced this. And if we weren't going to be the biggest, well, we played around with a couple ideas. We played around with the idea of pivoting, expanding, trying to reach other markets. But fundamentally, if you are made to serve one specific IP, like you are made for the Brony fandom, you can't kind of go like, well, we're now just going to be for like other fandoms. It doesn't really work like that. So there was certainly, so far, yeah. I guess there might be cons that try and pull that off. We'll see what the next couple of years bring. But after a lot of soul searching on staff, I think none of us wound up coming with a satisfactory answer for like, what can we do to bring the energy back? What can we do to get more people? We've gotten all VIPs, we can get more VIPs. So eventually, after a few years of that is what led us to end the event, or at least one of them, which I think overall was the right decision. Like it was the time for BronyCon to go.
I spent months fighting against this decision, and I am happy to admit that I was completely wrong. It was time for us to take that horse out back and go Old Yeller on it.
Old Yeller was a dog, first of all.
And
that was very emotional backstage to leading up to that, for real. Which, by the way, so from the perspective of the mascots, right? There were 3 of us, and like we would do these sort of skits, interactions, opening and closing ceremonies. They didn't tell us that the next year would be the last one until right before closing. And so this thing just like hitting us right there, and it's like, okay, go on stage. What? Like
we could have thought that through a little better.
Okay.
no, that was perfectly sadistic.
Yeah. So that was a really cool memory, because it really showed how important the event was to so many people. And I think BronyCon generally has always been memorable to me, since in being in that role, the number of people that would like come up and talk to us while we were in character as the mascots. And at the end of everyone after closing, we were like glorified mall Santas, basically.
Your line was insane.
Yeah.
It was through the lobby.
And hearing people talk very genuinely with you about their background, their story, difficulties they faced in their life, and how this fandom helps them overcome certain issues, come out of their shell in some sense. People that I don't know very well, I'll learn this person's name, and then they're telling you their life story, and it's just, that was a really interesting experience to be able to have that sort of, I guess, like, have that brief sort of intimate connection with someone, which really goes to show again just how impactful the community as a whole has been. So yeah, really good memory.
also. It was so great that we got to do it with this big, huge party at like this awesome year and tons of fanfare. And then COVID hit anyway, so we couldn't hook up right in front of
It was a perfect timing, actually.
It was a good timing, thankfully.
We've spent years talking how happy we were to not deal with the stress of running a convention during COVID.
Yeah, and one of the nice things as well is that I think it's really given other PonyCons a chance to flourish. So for example, we talked a lot in 2019 about how we were hoping that other PonyCons like Everfree and BABS would see this wave of attendance. As people didn't have BronyCon to go to, they would find other cons. And then COVID hit, so of course that didn't happen. But now that it's been a couple of years, I think we're starting to see that. So Everfree had a great year. HarmonyCon a couple weeks ago, not Nightmare. HarmonyCon had a great year as well. I heard, numbers were really, I think they had their best year ever.
They had over 1,000 for the first time.
That's amazing. So, even though the fandom maybe has changed in shape, it's really incredible that there's still people who are willing to come out, and that delayed wave of like post-BronyCon attendance is finally coming in and hitting all the other cons. So.
But again, BronyCon was the outlier because we compared BronyCon to all the other PonyCons. So Everfree Northwest was the second largest PonyCon. It's still like leagues smaller. So it's only BronyCon that was the outlier. So as a whole, the PonyCons were still kind of smaller than the furry cons during this period. But if you compare the largest furry cons and largest BronyCons, they're still nothing compared to these Comic Cons and anime cons. But again, if we compare them to Comic-Con, they're still nothing compared to Comic-Con. So there we go. So 80-year mark. I thought I was going to end the story there, but then we had the pandemic happen, and that changed the scene. And this is where Bronies actually have their second debut, because Bronies have had, while the furries were the most tech savvy during their period, the Bronies were kind of the most tech savvy during the modern period, and most Bronies were working IT. And during the pandemic, it would be natural that a virtual online con would form, and it would make sense it would come out of the Brony fandom, because Bronies have had a history of making online conventions for the longest time. So you had Horses at Home Con, you had ChocoCon, you had small fan-run online events done over live stream and Skype during this period. So it made sense when the pandemic happened that the BronyCons would be the first to make a virtual event. It started on a Discord server made by one of my friends, Ruth. She's in the dealer's den this weekend. She tried to make a dealer's group. And my friend Dex, who was the final vice chair of BronyCon, created PonyFest Online, which started to do a lot of integration. So they had panels through Zoom.
Well, I need to make it clear. So the way PonyFest started is Ruth, who's one of the artists, had formed an artist alley online. And basically I looked at that and I went, to draw people into this, you need additional content. And then there's a little Telegram channel that a bunch of us hang out in, and I'd like someone to make an online horse con. And then I went to bed. And I woke up the next day, and I'm like, no one's gonna do this if I don't do it. So I started recruiting, and one of the first people I recruited is in this audience right now, and is the real reason PonyFest worked, and that's Catherine over there. Woo! Who is the tech genius who coded all of the custom stuff that like all of the online PonyCons ran on throughout the pandemic. So if you went to any of the online events, give her a giant round of applause, because I was just an idiot with an idea. Cat was how it all came together, as well as the rest of everyone else who stepped up to volunteer. But yeah, we put the first PonyFest together in literally under a week.
Yeah, a week.
Like,
that was a fun week.
It got started on the Saturday around 2 or 3 in the afternoon East Coast time, and opening ceremonies were the next Saturday around 10 or 11 a.m. East Coast time. We basically did a bunch of them in the early pandemic before kind of pandemic fatigue started to set in, and everyone moved online, and some events got it, most events did not.
Like if you compare it to what the Comic Cons and Anime Cons are trying to do, it's not even close to the amount of energy and detail the Bronies and later Furries put in. Yeah. And I would say it was really only because PonyFest was so creative with how they did their musical events, their panels, partnering with Ponytown, I think was really what gave rise to the Furries eventually wanting to recreate a similar thing, but in VR chat.
Furry.
So if you've seen the Furry virtual cons, they would recreate their convention centers and that by I don't think the furries would have even gotten to that point if it wasn't for the friendly sibling rivalry Bronies and furries had trying to one-up each other.
Also want to give a quick shout out to Southeast Asia HarmonyCon, because they did something really unique as well, in that they built a convention center inside of Minecraft. It was like a heavily modded version of Minecraft that you could just download as a package. And yeah, you got your vendor hall right there.
See the booths.
They were able to they built panel rooms in a convention center in Minecraft, and they were able to pipe their live streams onto a big screen made of blocks. And it was really cool. And they did that before the furries did the VR stuff.
Again, I think it was the furries that followed through with that, saying, "Oh, we should probably do that better."
One of the things I remember back then is when we announced like PonyFest 2 and 3, other conventions getting angry at us for like, why aren't you giving us any room to breathe? And I remember thinking, because like, why not? The original vision for PonyFest was actually for us to host like the other horse cons kind of in our venue, aka the Discord server, but logistically that just didn't end up working out.
But PonyFest did partner with, like, I think Babs, Trot, and the Charlie Cons for assistance.
We did not. Catherine partnered with them in order to do all of their technical back end. I can claim 0 credit for this. Again, Kat is the real hero of the pandemic.
Yeah, you should be up here too, so yeah. If you want, actually, we want to talk a little bit about it, because you played such a big role, so if you want to talk a little bit about it. No worries.
Talk about the whole time you spent a month coding up an entirely custom technical backend that like no one else has replicated except maybe that one VTuber company like 3 years later. We could be rich if she let me sell it.
It was very impressive though, for people that participated in PonyFest in any way. There was so much going on the back end of that. Like, what you see in the server, plenty of places for people to chat there, but there's a whole other area where it's just staff working together and coordinating people, making sure people know when their time is coming up, getting the streams to work, troubleshooting the streams. People that are having trouble with their OBS crashing or not working, and having that happen on the back end in real time. And then some really great software that Kat put together that brings everything together and gets it to the right place.
I think this moment during the lockdown kind of proved how well furries and bronies run their conventions. Because when you looked at the type of virtual cons the furries and bronies were putting on, they were really well-run, well-oiled machines, did a lot of innovation when it came to technology, streaming, trying to make virtual events, trying to make musical events, online work. In comparison, if you saw what the anime cons and comic cons were trying to do, they were really struggling. Most of even the big comic cons had to outsource their virtual events to other third-party groups, and they were kind of cold and sterile. A lot of the big comic cons couldn't even do live panels, so they would have their panelists pre-record their panels, then upload them later. And because of that, you missed out on a lot of interaction, so you couldn't get live questions or feedback like you could with the furry and the brony virtual events. Now, outside of this circle, there was a lot of other interesting events being developed during the pandemic period. One of them I want to give a shout out to is Constellation, or basically a play on con and cancellation. It was basically billed as the con that never was. It was just a fun Facebook group where, fans who were missing out on cons could post their cat memes. And the other one I want to give notice that was very, very important was FireCon. FireCon was a con put on by the Fire Speculative Fiction magazine. This magazine was specifically geared for the Black and African American dysphoria, science fiction fans and writers, specifically trying to help promote and give a voice to fans of speculative fiction, authors and writers from the African dysphoria.
Alright, so FireCon came about pretty much because of COVID, and then the overlap of a few different world events. So first we had, there had been a pattern of observation, particularly from a lot of marginalized communities where they were receiving a somewhat lesser experience from traditional kind of in-person conventions. And that's something that we kind of kept track of for a while, me specifically, just because I'm nosy. So we had kind of this track record of things that were failing certain segments of the community, whether it was people of different ethnic or racial marginalizations being sort of pigeonholed into certain topics on programming, being put into positions of being the token on programming, so the only non-white person on a panel. There were accessibility issues that were kind of recurring in some of the longer running conventions. And so these things were sort of recurring themes every time convention season kind of rolled around. And then in the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter thing kind of took off. I also run File Literary Magazine, which is a magazine of Black speculative fiction. We are also on the Hugo ballot again this year and won last year. But because of who we are and what we represent, and especially at that time, we all of a sudden got this huge influx of cash. People wanting to show that Black art mattered. And so we were able to do a lot of doing sort of a convention or a workshop or a retreat was sort of a pipe dream when we got started maybe 6 years ago. But with the advent of COVID, we were able to, it kind of made virtual events more viable. And so we saw an opportunity to kind of address some of the concerns of the community that we've been observing, and put some of the extra funds we had to use to kind of develop FurCon, which we ran for 2 years.
Even when the pandemic lockdown was over, furry cons still kind of kept the virtual reality element that if you go to a lot of furry cons now, like here at BLFC, you'll still see that virtual reality portal where you can interact with the fans in VR chat as well. So I'm going to retire this version of the panel, so I kind of want to do my final thoughts on this group. So one thing I was predicting that would happen would be the online cons would kind of have a stay, but after the lockdown, most of the online cons kind of fizzled out and disappeared. Pony Fest is still kind of happening, but to a much smaller scale. And what we thought would be the death of the Brony conventions, the Brony cons are still going on. Now the Brony cons are not at the same number as they were previously. I think Everfree Northwest, which is now currently the largest pony con, probably only has about 2,000 to 3,000 attendees, so smaller than most mid-range furry cons. But they are still around. In fact, most of the Brony staffers have migrated over to the furry fandom. So like I said, the AV staff at most furry cons were imported over from the Brony side, but you also have a lot of musicians, artists, and volunteers from the Brony cons making their way over to the furry fandom. And the furry fandom is still using a lot of these old school science fiction model that was, like I said, started in the 90s, and it caused some growth issues. So like I said, the science fiction cons were really well suited for cons that are just a few hundred attendees at most. They were supposed to be under one roof and that's it. Because if you go to an old school science fiction con now, so if you go to BalticCon, for example, it's all held within one hotel and it's small and intimate. Like you would have like George R.R. Martin going out off to a room party. You might have a Star Trek actor at a bar. These are small intimate gatherings where you could just interact casually with, industry professionals, actors, writers. This is something you can't get when you have like thousands of attendees at your convention. And that thing is the problem because a lot of the furry cons, the reason why they became popular is because they offer the science fiction con model, which is very, very different from what the comic cons and anime cons are doing. They have basically everything under one roof. This is, I think, BLFC, for example, is on the threshold of this. Everything at BLFC is still held in one venue. All the concerts, the hotels, the dealers hall, everything's still within its venue. The moment BLFC breaks out of this and starts branching off into different hotels, I think it's a game changer for that. And we see this with AnthroCon and Midwest Furfest. Of course, they are still growing, so obviously they are doing something right. But it changes the dynamic because now that you have to shuttle in your fursuit from a hotel a mile away to the main event, you might not want to stay at the dance past 2 p.m. anymore, which is something that you start losing. It's growing too big. Yes, I see you have a hand up.
Okay, so TrotCon this year recently experienced this effect.
Yep.
Previously, TrotCon was in a single hotel. All the events, all the panels were in that same hotel. for the first year, TrotCon, well, actually last year, there was a huge influx of people trying to go. TrotCon was a Brony convention.
Yeah.
People were really trying to go to the TrotCon 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and they kept delaying it, and so there was a huge demand for the 2022 TrotCon.
There's a TrotCon meme going on, like
yeah. Marketing was like.
You actually because I've talked because I'm heavily involved because all my friends are like conscious of BronyCons. So we actually came up with a theory of why TrotCon had this issue. So TrotCon for the longest time was always held at a Crown Plaza.
Yes.
And it moved to a convention center that was connected to a Crown Plaza. So the theory was TrotCon wanted to use the Crown Plaza that was connected to the convention center. The problem was that Crown Plaza was going under renovations, so they could no longer use the hotel that was connected to the convention center. So the next best option was to use the outside hotels that had to shuttle people in and out, which caused that horrible decline. And also the other thing is TrotCon did face a lot of controversy. I don't want to get into it because I don't want to put personal opinions in there, but TrotCon does have what I call a VandyCon issue, where it's the con chair for life. So basically the original founder of the cons remains as a con chair, while most volunteer cons democratically elect a new con chair every few years. The founder of TrotCon has still remained the controlling head of TrotCon, and because of that, she only kind of invites her friends to run staff, and once her friends, I guess, piss her off, then she just cycles them out. I don't want to get too much into that. But let's end on a positive note. So yeah, that basically concludes the entire history of the conventions. Like I said, the early science fiction cons that started in the 1930s. Eventually, as the Comic-Cons broke off, the Trekkies helped inspire the multi-genre cons, and eventually the room parties that gave birth to the anime cons and the furry cons, like the one we're at, and of course the Bronies kind of being the child of that. The other con group I didn't really mention, but the video game cons came off of the electronic trade shows, eventually copied the science fiction con motto and the Comic-Con motto with the trade floors, and eventually kind of adapted that model as well. This is all one giant family tree. This is a way to show Comic-Con, anime cons, furry cons, we're not separate. We're all siblings of this greater, larger history of conventions. And with that, thank you all for coming to a panel. Continue this tradition, go to the room parties. Hope you guys have a good time here. Thank you very much for coming to the panel. Enjoy your time here.
Hey, thanks.
And give our surprise guests a round of applause as well. So this is where I like to end when I do this panel at PonyCons, I like to end it with, just by coincidence, I was at the final BronyCon concert and I recorded. So I talked about the history of folk music, right? I think Bronies kind of continue that tradition of folk music because they create fan music based on the show. This is a song made by a trans musician in the pony fandom. It's called Great to Be Different. The words kind of resonate, and if I ever made this panel into like a documentary, this will probably be the theme song of it because it doesn't represent just the pony fandom. I think it represents all these different cons.
There was
just